Hi, and welcome to Check Your Thread, a podcast about sewing more sustainably. My name's Zoe, and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 13 years and am the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me on this journey. Hello, lovely listeners. Welcome to episode 17 of Check Your Thread. I hope you're doing well. If you've decided to make a couple of gifts for upcoming festivities, I hope you're having a lot of fun with it. Last week, I started on a couple of things that I've decided to make for my kids for Christmas. My son has been asking for his own pair of dungarees for ages, so I traced off a pattern to start those. I'm using the Freddie Dungarees pattern by 2 Stitches. It includes both dungaree and pinafore options, and I've made the pinafore before for my daughter, which came out really nicely. For fabric, I'm going to use the denim that I harvested from a pair of Lander pants that I no longer fit into. Also, I'm going to make some doll's clothes for my daughter for a doll that she bought earlier this year from a charity shop. I'm using the School Cool Dolls dress pattern, which is a free one by Ellie and Mac, which I mentioned in episode 14, which was quick and cheap handmade gift projects. I had some real luck last week as well, because outside a charity shop I found the perfect dolls clothing rail that is just the right size. They literally wanted about 50p for it, so I'm going to try making some little hangers for it from pipe cleaners. So I'm going to give her that along with the clothes, which is going to be a really nice gift for Christmas. So in other sustainability goal news, I made some bramble jelly last week. So bramble jelly is basically blackberry jam, but you strain the fruit to remove the pips. You might be thinking, yeah, so... But I'm claiming it as a sustainability win in terms of food miles. So towards the end of the summer, for the last few years, I'm always keeping my eyes peeled for blackberries to pick. This year, the majority of my haul came from my local park, which is literally 2 minutes walk from my house. As I collect them over the weeks, I store them in my freezer, and then when the season is over and I can be bothered to make the jam, I just need to buy a pack of preserving sugar and clean out all the jam jars that I've been hoarding for the purpose. Honestly though, I love picking the blackberries, I hate making the jam, but I love the eating of it. I also love getting free food, so that's kind of win in itself as well. This week I want to say a big thanks to Nina, who is the newest supporter of Check Your Thread on Patreon. If you want to be a super cool supporter of the podcast like Nina, you can find the link on checkyourthread.com, or you can go to patreon.com/checkyourthread. One more point of business, the November edition of the Check Your Thread newsletter is imminent. You can sign up via checkyourthread.com and you'll receive some additional blatherings from me, some links to some super cool and interesting stuff I've found, some sneaky peeks into future episodes, and the opportunity to help shape the show. Okay, on to today's episode. So I wanted to produce this one as a bit of a primer on the topic of zero waste sewing patterns. So whilst clothing made using zero waste practices is as old as clothing itself, zero waste patterns available for home sewing is a relatively new phenomenon. In the last 5 years or so, we've seen more and more zero waste patterns become available for home sewing, and more articles, blog posts and podcast episodes discussing the topic. However, I reckon there are a lot of people who sew clothing who don't know about them yet, or who have heard the term but aren't quite sure what it means. So I'm throwing my own Intro to Zero Waste Sewing Patterns episode into the ring. There's so much to the subject. I honestly feel that someone could make a whole podcast just on zero waste sewing patterns and techniques. I would definitely subscribe to that. But it is a topic that I know that I will come back to again and again for Check Your Thread, and there are heaps of designers and practitioners that I want to speak with. This episode lays a bit of the groundwork to build on with future episodes. Alrighty, here we go. So what are zero waste sewing patterns all about? Let's start at the beginning with the underlying concerns. So fabric production is an incredibly resource-hungry set of activities. It uses vast amount of energy, time, water, chemicals, labour and so forth. Waste and damage are created at virtually every stage, from growing the plants or farming the animals for natural fibres, or the extraction of fibres from fossil fuels in the case of synthetics, to the fibre processing, carding, spinning, weaving or knitting, dyeing, finishing, printing and transportation. Yet after the input of all these resources and the creation of all this damage to make the stuff, so much is then wasted before the fabric even gets made into garments. So the first figure that is always quoted at the beginning of any discussion of zero-waste clothing design is that in conventional garment mass production, an average of 15% of the fabric is unused by inefficient lay plans. It is also estimated that 400 billion square metres of fabric was produced globally in 2015 alone for clothing. Therefore, if 15% of that was wasted when the garments were cut, we're looking at a shocking 60 billion square metres approximately of discarded cloth worldwide for 2015 alone. These figures are quoted in the Zero Waste Fashion Design book by Holly McQuillan and Timo Rissanen, which I thoroughly recommend. Well, those figures are obviously horrendous, but for those of us who sew our own clothes, that's not our issue, right? Well, as I argued in episode 8, Is Sewing Sustainable? Whether we sew our own clothes at home or they're sewn by someone else in a factory, the resources, waste and damage that are embedded in the fabric that we buy to sew with will be the same as the fabric used in mass-produced garments. Plus, when clothing production is scaled up commercially, it's likely the factory's lay plan will be tighter than the lay plans we are able to create per metre at home. I've been meaning to do this for ages, but it'd be so interesting to weigh a length of fabric before cutting out your project, and then weigh the scraps that are left over once your project is cut out. Can we all please start doing that and comparing what we find? But whatever the precise percentage that goes unused, home sewing is also responsible for the waste of those embedded resources. So what is zero waste pattern design and how can it waste fewer of those resources? The term zero waste has been in use since the 1970s at least. It wasn't really applied to clothing design until about 15 years ago. However, zero waste sewing has effectively been the predominant method of clothing manufacture throughout history. In essence, it is the production of an item of clothing where the entire length and width of a section of fabric is incorporated into that garment. That might mean that the entire section of fabric is folded or draped, then tied or stitched in some way to be worn on the body. Or it might mean that a section of fabric is slashed at strategic points or even cut up into smaller shapes, and then those slashes or cut edges are joined to create a form that can be worn. Up until industrialisation made fabric manufacture quicker and simpler, therefore making fabric cheaper, it was viewed as a valuable and precious resource, and the thought of cutting away and discarding parts would have been unthinkable to most. Examples of clothing that use the whole of the fabric can be found throughout history throughout the world. If you'd like to dig deeper into some specific examples, Liz Hayward filmed a class via Zoom called Zero Waste Sewing Legacy, which has just become available on demand via twinsneedles.com. So at some point, when fabric became cheaper and more readily available, wasting some of it in the pursuit of different clothing shapes and styles became an option. Beforehand, the form of the garment was inherently linked to how the fabric would be divided and the pieces put together. Afterwards, designing the shape of a garment has increasingly become separated from the process of drafting the shapes that will make that design a reality. Clothing is often designed with little thought of how those flat 2D shapes of a pattern will look, and how they will be cut from the fabric, or even how they'll be put together. Today, it's very common for a clothing designer to be working in a different city or even a different country to the person drafting the pattern, and it's likely that neither of them will meet the person creating the cutting layouts. But zero-waste clothing design didn't completely disappear. For example, there are many types of traditional garments, including kimonos and saris, that have always been produced to utilise the entire piece of fabric. And throughout the 20th century, there were many wonderful and innovative approaches to what we now think of as zero-waste clothing design, all over the globe, from workwear in China to gowns produced in Paris. But it seems to have taken on a new impetus during the 21st century. So as people are becoming increasingly aware of the scale and damage caused by the fashion industry, particularly since the rise of fast fashion, there's been a renewed interest in zero-waste clothing design as a way to reduce some of the waste and damage. Some designers and more forward-thinking companies are reintegrating the pattern cutting process into the garment design process and working out how to eliminate the 15% of wasted fabric from the very beginning. And thanks to some imaginative designers of sewing patterns, we can also try this different approach to creating garments and accessories at home. I plan to talk to some zero-waste sewing pattern designers, and I'm intrigued to hear how they discovered the concept and how they subsequently designed differently. But in the meantime, let's talk about what using zero-waste patterns means for us. So like most mass-produced garments, most of the regular sewing patterns we buy and use at home will have been created based on a series of pattern blocks. These blocks are basic templates that fit together to make a variety of simple garments. A pattern cutter or pattern maker will trace off a set of these blocks, then make changes until they have achieved a close approximation of the garment design that they are aiming for. Another approach to making patterns is called draping, where fabric is draped and pinned directly onto a dress form until a nice look has been achieved, and then that fabric is then taken off and a paper pattern is made from that. These are the main approaches taught to fashion students and on pattern making courses. But either way, to quote the Milan AVJC website, if pattern pieces are not designed to fit together perfectly on a rectangle, empty spaces will remain between them. Honestly, I have a real gap in my knowledge that I hope to fill about how zero-waste sewing patterns are created. But from what I understand, there is no single approach, so each zero-waste designer probably has their own unique set of approaches that depend on the type of garment or accessory pattern they wish to create. But when we buy a zero-waste or low-waste sewing pattern, we won't be getting a page of individual shapes labelled front bodice, back bodice and sleeve and so on to cut out. Depending on the designer and the design, it's likely we won't receive pattern pages at all. Often zero-waste patterns come in the form of a diagram of shapes that we need to draw directly onto our fabric to divide it up. Sometimes specific measurements are given, and sometimes we are asked to divide it into fractions of the total width. For example, by dividing the width of our fabric into thirds and drawing a line down the first third of the fabric. It could be a very different experience for a sewist to use a zero-waste sewing pattern. At first it may seem really complicated and confusing, but as you divide up your fabric and start stitching the shapes and edges together, the style reveals itself and it's a really exciting experience. So let's talk about some upsides to working with zero-waste sewing patterns. So I would say that no matter what level of sewing ability you currently have, it can be a really fun and different experience. And if you've been sewing for a long time and you've made a lot of garments, then I really recommend you try zero-waste sewing patterns to mix things up and try something new. Also, you often need less fabric to make a zero-waste sewing project than you would an equivalent garment from a regular sewing pattern. This isn't always true though. And once you've got your head around using a zero-waste pattern, you can find ways to adapt, alter or add to the design. If you have more fabric than the pattern calls for, you may be able to make some fun additions to use the extra fabric. I really feel that zero-waste patterns offer more freedom to personalise the outcome than a regular pattern, although it might not be obvious how you can do that in the beginning. Plus, you're not left with lots of weird shaped fabric scraps that can be hard to find uses for. Any waste remaining from a zero or low waste sewing pattern, perhaps because the width of your fabric was slightly different to what was called for in the pattern, it's more likely to be rectangular strips which are easier to piece together and use for something else in the future. Plus, the garment styles themselves are often more unique, with more volume and design ease in various places, than garments made with regular patterns. This may be a downside, of course, if you want your wardrobe to appear more conventional and each piece more fitted. So on to those downsides. I think one of the main ones is that it can be difficult to work out how, when or where to make any fit adjustments to zero-waste sewing projects. And from what I understand, because of the constraint of fabric widths, grading across a wide range of sizes can be a challenge. Having said that though, Liz Hayward's zero-waste patterns span a really impressive size range, so there are options out there for most bodies. If you're trying to sew from your stash, it may be difficult to find a piece of fabric the correct length to avoid fabric waste, which of course is the underlying intention. And it's a newly emerging area in the home sewing world, so there aren't heaps of style options available yet. So where can we get our hands on some zero-waste sewing patterns? So I'm not going to list every zero-waste pattern designer out there in this episode. If you're looking for a more comprehensive list, I'd recommend checking out the Zero-Waste Pattern Database. It doesn't look like it's been updated for a while, but it has got many designers and their patterns listed. So specific designers I would recommend you check out include Birgitta Helmersson. She's a Swedish designer with some wonderful, very wearable styles that have done a lot to popularise the whole zero-waste sewing pattern trend over the last year or so. And Liz Hayward. She's an Australian designer who blogs and sells patterns through her site The Craft of Clothes. She has a number of fantastic and very wearable solo patterns, plus a whole book including lots more called Zero Waste Sewing. Milan AVJC. This whole website is really worth a read, and they have a number of patterns to download for free with the option of giving a donation. Australian designer LB Textiles has the Zero Waste Maynard dress pattern for sale, plus a free robe tutorial. Make Use is a New Zealand-based collective involved in research, exploration and education around zero waste design, and they have a number of open source patterns available. Chris Wood Sews is a maker and designer with a small but very lovely range of zero and low waste patterns. And finally, I want to mention Thread Faction Studio, who have a really sweet range of zero waste patterns for kids' clothes. I've bought and printed out the zero waste cap sleeve tee, which I will report back on once I've made it. So as you know, I often talk about free sewing patterns in tutorials. I want to say that I 100% believe that a designer should be paid for their work. And whenever you use and enjoy a free sewing pattern, if you are able to, then please consider making a donation to the designer if that's an option. Or consider buying one of their other products if you like it, or promoting them if possible via social media. But I do regularly mention free resources because I think it's important to push back against the idea that sewing is only open to those with a large disposable income. So thanks to Milan AVJC, LB Textiles and Make Use, who I just mentioned, for producing zero waste sewing pattern resources to be accessed for free. Zero Waste Wardrobe is a Finnish website that also has a really impressive range of garments, all created by zero waste patterns, which are also available for free. And check out that zero waste pattern database and click on the free tag to find many more to try. So as I said in the beginning, there are an increasing amount of zero waste sewing patterns available for home sewers. Personally, I'm so excited by this development for multiple reasons. As someone who's been sewing my own clothes for a long time and have tried making almost every type of garment at this stage, it's really fun to get to explore a different, new-to-me approach to making clothes. Plus, the more I look into the topic, the more I'm astounded by the talent and skill of zero waste designers to produce patterns in this way. It's such a different way of approaching pattern making to the standard way that I was taught. And because currently at least there aren't any set steps to becoming a designer of zero waste sewing patterns, rather an overarching set of principles, it is inherently an area that encourages, even demands, innovation and experimentation, and it's pretty thrilling to think about what is to come. The zero waste sewing pattern scene as it currently stands reminds me of how the independent sewing pattern scene looked about 10 to 12 years ago in terms of scale. Right now, the amount of designers producing zero or low waste sewing patterns isn't massive, so you can research your options without getting too overwhelmed. But excitingly, the amount of zero waste sewing patterns is definitely growing, so it's a great time to dip your toe in. So I want to leave you with a selection of resources that will help you explore the topic further. Zero Waste Design Online is a global not-for-profit community that has heaps of resources and information related to zero waste design. And if you're on Instagram, it's definitely worth following them. They are at ZWDO_collective because they often post about home sewing related zero waste stuff too. The amazing resource that is the Socialists blog has a whole series of posts as part of a zero waste themed month that they hosted in February. The Love to Sew podcast devoted an episode to discussing various aspects of zero waste sewing. That was their episode 180. And previous Check Your Thread guest Wendy Ward has a great blog post called Zero Waste Sewing. And finally, Seamwork have a fantastic article called Zero Waste Design, the Creation of Waste-Free Garments, written by Jessica Yen. So if you've tried sewing with some zero waste sewing patterns or you're inspired to do so, please let me know. Let me know how you got on. Let me know what you enjoyed. Let me know where you stumbled. I'd love to hear so we can continue this discussion going forward. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!